Welcome to Drinking on the Edge. I'm its host and co-producer, David Fuhrer, in the studio here at Radio Free Rhinecliff, behind the Epicurean, for which Radio Free Rhinecliff would not be possible without, is Matthew Mercier, my engineer, and today's topic is the wines of New Mexico, far away from the Hudson Valley where we are, but their wines are well worth discovering. Not easy to find anywhere outside the confines of the Enchantment state. New Mexico is worth a visit for a great many reasons. Wine is one of them, and we're going to hear a little bit about why this is not necessarily a modern invention, but it has some historical background too. The three vintners we have with us today have been elemental in helping to create the contemporary situation in New Mexico wines. They all have their own businesses and websites to run, but for any of you seeking the bigger picture of New Mexico wines, I recommend you go to the website nmwine.com, nmwine.com. That is the website of the New Mexico Wineries Association, New Mexico Wine. Check it out. Lots of information there, and you get to get a lay of the land of all what's going on in New Mexico. But we have with us today from Luna Rossa Winery, Marco D'Andrea. Welcome, Marco.
Thank you, David.
From Vivac Cellars on the opposite end. So I forgot to mention that Marco's on the southern end. Way up in the northern end, we got Michele Padberg of Vivac Cellars. Welcome, Michele.
Thank you so much for having us.
And somewhere in the state, with his fingers in all parts of it, is Jasper Riddle of Noisy Water Winery in Ruidoso. Welcome, Jasper.
Awesome. Thank you for having us. I'm excited.
For the uninitiated, they might not know that the history of wine in this part of the world overall kicked off in New Mexico. There's been some argument for the historians amongst us to what extent it began in Florida versus New Mexico, but all has to do with those pesky Spaniards who were making their mark across the Atlantic here. If you could give us some background of New Mexico's link with the beginnings of wine in the New World.
Maybe I can start off with a broad spectrum and let my friends jump in with some fine-tuned details. But you're right, David. 400 years ago, in 2029, New Mexico will celebrate our 400th anniversary of winemaking. And that was wines coming up with your missionaries and with your church as the Southwest was being established. And obviously for Spain at that point in time, it's changed hands a couple times since then. But you've had this lineage and this backbone of wine as a sense of community in New Mexico for 400 years. One of the notes I like to point on is when people argue over maybe Florida or California just didn't document as well as New Mexico. But I would like to add that when Prohibition came around, New Mexico, no one was concerned about New Mexico. So you've had winemaking and grape growing. We had just become a state during Prohibition. We had a handful of years under our belt. It was still very much the Wild West. So this state has had a real identity revolving around wine for 400 years. The modern chapter is the one that we talk about the most now, and it's the one I'm the most excited about. It's the one I get to be a part of. But I think that started really in the 80s with a lot of French, German, and Italian winemakers coming over with the Grouet family, with Lascombe's family. And then with Marco's father and people like Bernd Meyer that came over to try to make New Mexican wines and put it on the map. And as many know, Grouet did in a lot of ways, from the beautiful bubbles that were being produced in this state and still continued produced by them. And so that was the chapter when I got in 10 years ago. I was lucky that I had Marco was still in diapers, and Michele and her wonderful group were doing their own thing in the north. But New Mexico didn't necessarily have an identity or path forward. And you had a lot of aging wineries and aging winemakers. And in the past decade, you've had a lot of people jumping together. And my hat tip goes to the people that are sitting here now, because everybody likes each other. And I think that's a really cool part of the New Mexican story. And that's why I like sitting at this table. I know friends from other winemaking regions that you wouldn't get to sit with their friends. And so it's cool to have that. And I'm sure Marco and Michele can tell more, and I'll let Marco tell his father's story, because that's one of my own favorites of the state of New Mexico. And as I call Paulo the godfather of New Mexico wine, I think is aptly named.
Yeah, a word not from Marco having taken more of the reins of the family operation there in Deming and nearby. I would have gladly had Paulo aboard, but Marco has definitely proved his mettle in these last several years. Marco, take it away.
Thank you, David. I will say my word at the winery is not the final word still. Paulo still is very much involved, though now my suggestion at least gets taken seriously and put under consideration rather than just one person deciding everything. So I'd say now is more of a 50-50 split. But going back to a little bit on the historical portion, it's funny because if you ask my dad when he came to the States in 86, you can say he was very surprised because when he was told to come here, he was told there was already operating vineyards. But as you could imagine, they weren't very well maintained in the 80s in New Mexico. So, they make a lot of jokes that they dropped him in the middle of nowhere and told him to figure it out. But he ended up figuring it out. And it wasn't just him by himself. Also, the Lescone family on the opposite side of town also had to figure it for themselves as well, because there was nobody with experience that continued to produce vineyards or grapes or wine. Everyone maybe started, maybe entered halfway through, but then everyone always ended up dropping out. And so now there's a little bit more of continuation of this grape growing culture in southern New Mexico, which obviously differs a lot from northern New Mexico just because of the difference in elevations and climates between the both of us. But for the moment, southern New Mexico supplies most of the grapes of Vitis vinifera for most of the state. Some cold hardy varietals survive up north, but for the most part, the higher you go up, the more you're looking at hybridized varietals.
Just to kind of bring it back to an historical perspective, and even though grapes were being grown for wine production, going back to, I believe, the 16th century in New Mexico, it wasn't as though there was an unbroken lineage of wine production. There was a few, home growers of grapes, perhaps for their own interest, but no wine, certainly well away from a commercial standpoint for hundreds of years. And as Jasper had mentioned before you, Margo, these things kind of kicked off in the 1980s. So there was no history to rely upon. So history was being created starting in the 1980s of what is New Mexico wine to where we are today in 2025.
I do want to just stick in there a little bit of a historical reference as well, in that while we go back to 1629 as the inception date, there was a great deal of chaos happening in the state as far as who was in charge and who was setting up shop, so to speak. And that's creating towns and regions. And while the Spanish were coming in and trying to create these new colonies and cities and planting grapes, we then had the Pueblo revolts. We were also looking at a great deal of warfare that was happening in each of these smaller subsections of New Mexico. And during that time, the paperwork, the trail that we have as a lot of that proof was burned up. A lot of the churches were burned, a lot of any kind of trail that would make sense to us now, right? That we have it written down in some kind of logbook. A lot of that was lost. So what we have is looking back at little pieces that have been able to be resurrected and tell the story, but not in the kind of girth that, say, California has that kind of track record. So a lot of people do think that it's contested in the books, so-called history books, but we do have proof that we were creating a great deal of wine in the 1800s. We were one of the main producers of wine, and we were one of the big stops as people were going from the East Coast over to the West Coast during the gold rush to refuel their stocks of wine as they were traveling. It was a lot safer to go south and hit through us than through the Midwest and head over because of some of the bigger tribal pueblos that were better capable of defending their territory. And so it's an interesting little tidbit that we did have a great deal of success, ebb and flow through New Mexico that just isn't really publicized.
It was based upon it being a transit point from east to west. Is that what you're saying, Michele?
Yes.
I did want to throw in there that whether you want to look at it positively or not, the main reasoning for the presence of wine, which Michele briefly mentioned too, is if it wasn't for Catholicism being so aggressive on how they try to spread the religion, wine definitely would not be here if it wasn't for monks, friars, priests, that kind of stuff. Because really there was no I wouldn't say there was no necessity, but rather they were worried about other things at the time. But when it comes to Catholics, for some reason, historically, wine is just the tip of the iceberg for them. It's so important for the religious aspect and just for normal culture as well, which the Spanish would have been included in that as well as the Italian.
Certainly, and the conquistadors' mentality was hand in glove with that of the missionaries, and of course the wine helped to serve the interests of the soldiers. Making their hard way across these new lands as well.
And if you dropped me off in the middle of nowhere and told me to help settle an area, I would have made sure that alcohol production came with me. So that's one of the few highlights, I think.
Yeah, just wait until they tell you you're going to get taxed.
So bring us back to the more modern era, 1980s. The name Gruet and Paulo's names were dropped. What else was going on back then, and how do things transform from then to now?
I guess I could continue on that one slightly. So I would say prior to 84-ish, there was a big influx of French immigrants that kind of were restarting some of the vineyards, planted some new vineyards, rekindling everything. And a lot of them got this idea that they thought they were going more to a California type climate and not a desert type climate. So a lot of them ended up abandoning what they were doing. And then the follow-up would have been more like what we continued on ourselves. Paulo did for New Mexico vineyards, and then as well as the Lescombe family did, as well as the Gruet family did. Even then, Gruet was also had some vineyards for themselves, but they also had to source it because it was just, at the time, it was a little bit unreliable, the amount of vineyards that were being, I wouldn't say not being maintained, but being maintained for commercial growth. Which is a different aspect than just keeping your vines alive.
What are other challenges besides stressing out the vines in the hot, dry climate do you all face there in New Mexico and in the smaller and larger context? What sets the viticultural and vinification aspects and the investment aspects in New Mexico, grape growing and winemaking, what sets it apart from other notable U.S. wine regions?
It's a losing business.
It's a losing business a lot of places, I think. We can't put ourselves that alone. But I think the serious note is we don't have this large industry to support us, right? It's not super established. We're still all paving the road together, which is great because we don't get typecast. We don't just say, hey, you make Cab and Pinot and that's it. And you can't make anything else because that's the only thing people coming to this region are going to drink in forever. And it's hard to change that. And so I have some friends, that's where they make wine. And unfortunately, that's what they do. New Mexico had no plan to market, so there's a little bit of everything planted. So as a winemaker, it's a full palette of great color that we get to paint with, though at times, if you try to grow and scale, to Michelle's point, it's hard to do because the thing that your customer wants, you may not have enough of it planted. But we're on an island in a lot of ways in the sense that we don't get a lot of support, and it's all of us helping each other. And though our land costs a lot less, your startup capital is more because there's no mobile cross-flow or filtration systems running around the state. And so if you want to do it here, you have to make the investment or you have to be a really good neighbor. And so it's an interesting sense. I was talking to a winemaker from Napa recently. You're Napa in the 80s. I honestly want to move there now that we talk about it. When our crush pad equipment goes down, you're calling friends to borrow equipment because you're not going to get support out of California.
We may be in the 2020s, and then winemaking of any consequence only really kicked off 40 years ago. But you are all still relative pioneers. You're located in 3 distinctly different geographical locations. So for those people who are, and even professionals who are just listening maybe for the first time about hearing about New Mexico wines, what, climatically or geographically or in terms of altitude, what sets apart the different wine growing areas of this admittedly pretty large state? So you got to have some diversity there. What's going on?
I'll jump in right there. We are in a very unique little area. We are between Taos and Santa Fe. So we have some of the world's best skiing happening in Taos. 2 very distinct artistic communities. We are very lucky to be in a little valley that is protected a little bit more than what you would see in Taos or in Santa Fe, but we are at 6,000 feet. So our estate vineyards are considered extreme elevation. And so we actually have 3 properties, and they start at 58. We have our 1725, which is next to our tasting room, and that is at 6,000 feet. And then we have our fire vineyard, which is over where our winemaking facility is, that is at 6,200 feet. And our passion has been a constant motivation toward education and research and learning what we could do in our unique microclimate. Each of our vineyards are only 10 minutes drive from each other, but very distinctive microclimates. And so we're able to grow different grapes in those different areas. For us, we're passionate about growing vinifera at these extreme altitudes, not doing the hybrids. And when we got into this, we actually got started in 1998, and we were really young and naive, but really passionate about trying to show that we didn't have to make Baco Noir wines, and that there was real value in the land that we had, even though it seemed completely bonkers to try to grow grapes at 6,000 feet. We've been really excited to travel, learn from other winemakers, learn from different areas around the world what you can do. And we're really pleased to be able to offer anything that we learn on any of our research, any of the trials and tribulations to other people around the state and elsewhere. And so for us, that's something that makes us really unique, is being just so high in elevation and having success with these vinifera grapes.
Jasper, Marco?
I guess I could add on to a little bit. So obviously she's higher up than I am. I'm on the lower part of the state. I'm about 30 minutes from the Mexican border. Altitudes we're looking at there around 4,300 feet. I just have 2 vineyards now. I have one bigger plot about 12 miles from the winery, and then I have one that's immediately where we have the winery. I would say they change. I wouldn't say so much of mine change the weather, rather than I do have different soil types. One's a lot sandier, and the other's definitely a lot more clay involved into the soils and silt. I am very... how you say, I can't think of the word in English. We're very fortunate that we don't really have issues growing vinifera grapes. Of course, some grow better than others. So much like Michele, our ideology has always been to push more the vinifera. Not that we have anything against hybrids, but if we have no necessity for them, I don't think I need to introduce them. And then also because we run our nursery, we keep a pretty big stockpile on hand of varietals. We're really into trying everything sometimes. Some stuff that some people typically don't. Who would have said Ribolla Gialla is being grown in southern New Mexico? It's just a random varietal to be thinking that could grow here, and it grows quite well.
Or Vermentino, such as we'll be tasting today.
Yeah, and Vermentino, another one, it's already not super popular in Italy, but then you bring it from Sardinia all the way to the States, but then it makes its way to New Mexico. And I think actually that's one of our best growing reds at the moment. That and Arnais grow very well here. You do need to be mindful it's a lot warmer here. Things mature faster, so you have to have the perfect timing for just about everything. But it's easy to always say positive things. If I wanted to bring up a negative, I could throw out that if we had a little bit less alkaline soils, it would probably improve even more some varietals that specifically crave those high acid wines. But that's something you can't change. That's given just based off of where you're growing and everything. But for the moment, I wouldn't say there's any varietal we can't grow in the sense of an agricultural aspect. But then on a qualitative level, you could discuss maybe some varietals are definitely going to do better here than others. Like we know Tempranillo is a sun-loving grape, so it's going to do good. Sauvignon Blanc sometimes can be picky and doesn't like to be too mature. So you have the flip of the dime on that one.
Worth mentioning is that something that Jasper and Michele know quite well and we'll refer to later when we taste one of Michele's wines. That is the D'Andrea family not only grows grapes for its Luna Rossa brand, it grows grapes for a great number of clients, both within and outside of New Mexico. You're a great supplier to some famous Texas wineries as well. So the acreage of planted and producing wine grapes there is beyond what your brand capacity can accommodate. So that's really important to understand what Luna Rossa is doing there too. Jasper, can you chime in with your perspective on things?
Yeah, I'm fortunate because I get to work with a lot of fruit from a lot of different growers in the state. I think last year I had a dozen different vineyards that were bringing fruit into our facilities. Outside of my own, I have Gouret's original vineyard here in New Mexico, and then I have a new planting in Rincon just south of Hatch, north of Las Cruces. The original vineyards and where a lot of the plantings were in New Mexico outside of Deming were near the Elephant Butte Lake area. Near Truth or Consequences. Famous landmarks are where spaceport's flying into space from right now, and then where Ted Turner owns 700,000 acres of nature preserve are the other significant things. And then the Trinity site was 60 miles from there too, but that's not as fun to talk about when you're talking Taos. But some pretty notable landmarks. But the Angle sites, you're talking 4,700 feet, so it's a blend between the two. Whereas my Rincon site's closer to Marco, and we're in 4,100 some change, depending on where you are on that site. And I see fruit from all across the state. So I see exactly what Michelle's talking about. You get these little micro pockets where you'd say, whoa, I can't believe that grows there. And it grows extremely well there. And that's the beauty of New Mexico. We have a huge diurnal shift across the whole entire state. So you'll change 40 degrees in Fahrenheit from day to nighttime temperatures. And that's great for grape growing. I get a lot of phenolic ripeness. I see a lot of things that my friends in the American Southwest may not be as opportunistic to see. To Marco's point, their soil chemistry is, let's just say I use more tartar than I want to see over time, but that's just that's a part of it as a winemaker, and at least we know how to handle that. But I get fruit quality that some of my friends in other parts of the Southwest don't get to see, so I take it all the time. And I like the diversity, and we're still trying to figure out what grows from your vinifera to non-vinifera, and I play with both in the winery, vinifera dominant, but I do have a couple of non-vinifera winners, some hybrid winners that I really like to bring in here and there. But it's cool because it's the 5th largest state by landmass, and it's extremely diverse. So if you drop New Mexico in the middle of Europe, you'd be covering in the middle of Europe, you'd cover multiple countries, not just one. So you really can get, if you cut this to Michelle's point earlier, right, the way it was a couple hundred years ago, is this thing there's a lot of different little regions and a lot of different little areas, and all have their own dynamics in more ways than one. So I like that as a grower. It's also funny when people call me and it's like, I give everybody a free hour of my time when they're trying to get in this industry for good, bad, or otherwise. And it's, what should I plant? Where are you? What's the soil look like? What's the water look like? And you just can't even tell me, oh, I'm near Marco, because within 30 minutes of Marco, as he can tell you, there's mountains, there's valleys, there's a lot. Soil changes. I see it change on site. So I think that's part of why we don't have this massive uniformity of 1 million acres of Pinot Noir. But it is this sense that kind of makes us unique. And I think from a boutique standpoint, will always keep us boutique, because we're not going to just find one winner that can conquer the whole state that you can run to market with.
That seems to me to be an excellent segue into tasting the first of the 9 wines, 3 each of you, that you've provided for us to taste and talk about today. This is a pink wine, a rosé wine, made from the Mission grape, sometimes known as Pais. And this is one of Jasper's creations. And this is, again, a historical link to the past, the Spaniards that we had mentioned earlier. Run us through it, Jasper.
I really wanted to showcase Mission. I have 3 separate growers that are growing it. They're playing with it. And so for me, I really wanted to see where it would do the best and how it would do the best. The first handful of years, I tried to use it just as a standalone red. But if you've ever seen Mission, it could look very uneven ripening, but it could be at 25 bricks when it's coming to the winery. And there's all these things about it. So I wanted to play with making lineage here in the state of New Mexico, but I think we found a nice use for it. So I do Charmat method or bulk process. And one of the things I like about this is it really gives me some of those bready, yeasty notes that are coming through in this that I don't see in that much method Champenois. And I think it showcases the fruit quality really beautifully. I love the story that it's the one that was planted 400 years ago and the one that keeps us relevant. But I also like the tip to the 80s inception of what New Mexico is now and to some of our big producers. This is our first vintage out. My uncle, who runs my vineyard, told me if I asked him to plant it, he would quit. So luckily, I have other friends in the state that grow grapes because it's a monster in the vineyard. It's not attainable in the sense, and that's the interesting thing with vinifera. And Mission is loosely vinifera in my mind, but it's the things that are wild and out there is they don't want you to keep them manicured and do all the pretty little sweet things that the grapes that we've worked alongside with for hundreds of years will do.
No,
I want to say that, Jasper, I 100% agree with you that it's loosely a vinifera. Mission to me presents as a hybrid so big time. And with that, it can really lean heavy into those nasty kind of characteristics that can be really difficult in the winery. Like you said, the growing, it's a voracious grower. And then you get a hold of it and its acids can be way out of whack and the tannins can be too heavy. It can dominate. And I find that a lot of people really don't make really beautiful mission wines. And I think you found the exact perfect use for this grape. I really love this wine that you've made. And I think it's such a perfect expression of what mission can be and what everybody was hoping it was going to be able to do in the state, having this resurrection of it's, got this great story, like you're saying. And I think the way to do that is with this wine.
Do you have a bottle of that there with you? Open there, Marco?
Yes, I did not put it in the room. It's next to me,
never mind.
but I did just try it.
All right. So let's move on, please, to the next of your wines you provided us here, Jasper.
Absolutely. Next, we can jump into our Super New Mexican would be my choice and my preference. And this is one that for me, it's a Super Tuscan emulation. New Mexico, so the hat tip to Paulo D'Andrea, but a lot of our plantings and a lot of successful plantings are Italian and brought over by Paulo. When we get into, and so working with that, and then also wanting to get an American consumer to understand Italian varietals more, and the nuances, right? And understanding that you can have all of that tannin and all of that structure in a wine that's medium bodied, I think throws a lot of Americans off because that's not standardly what they're used to having in their glass. And so I wanted to showcase it in a different way. So Sangiovese and Cabernet Sauvignon, in this, we do free run Cabernet. So I'm trying to keep a little more of those coarse tannins out. And then actually aged in Foudre. So I do have some Foudres in the winery. So I have some 5,000 liter Foudres, it's Hungarian oak. Very low toast, very similar to the Italian playbook and some of my favorite wines that are made across the world when you talk Super Tuscan. And then I had to play around and show Super New Mexican. And also the thing that grows the best in New Mexico, the Western Diamondback rattlesnake on the label. It's one that's fun for me. I think it shows the brevity of the fruit. This fruit is Paulo's fruit. You're talking about the Luna Rossa and us bulk when it comes to this one. I snuck a little bit of my own Cabernet in there from an angle, actually, but it's majorly Paulo's fruit. And it's one that I really like. I like where it's going, and it's a styled wine that I want to make more of. And I think that American wine consumers are going to appreciate more of because it's not super over oaked, over mega purpled, and seen with high alcohol. And I wanted to go something that was more that before, during, and after dinner red. That was my thought here.
It's pretty streamlined style. The tannins are well tuned. And for out of curiosity, the Sangiovese to Cabs ratio is 3-1. For anybody wanting to know. Yeah, it's this 2021 is certainly drinking okay now. The tannins are definitely not dominant, but it can certainly keep up for a few more years, open up even further.
That's one of the things I wanted to show, and I like to show, is that New Mexico had the ability to lay around. It had the ability to showcase fruit in a variety of different ways. And I was one of when you asked me what to send, I think just the brevity of wine that we're showing here showcases New Mexico because you can do so many things here, and you're just not typecast into this one standard method of winemaking. And so I love our fruit and I love our growers for that. Though when something jumps and the consumer wants more and we don't have planted acres, it makes you slam your head into the wall. But that's why we all get to plant, right? So
one of the things that you have working there that is part of what people can contend with in New Mexico wines is you have a population around about 2 million, growing a little bit faster percentage-wise than a lot of other states at this point. But still, it's hovering around 2 million. That's not a lot of people in what's a lot of land to cover. And of course, those grapes are not grown in the big city, though some are grown on the periphery, no doubt. I know that in Albuquerque. But that said, it's not easy. It's not an easy thing to manage vineyards and to create wineries there. And you do live somewhat seasonally, in as much as you get a lot of outsiders coming in to enjoy the beautiful spaces that New Mexico occupies, come summer and all that. And as well, your growing seasons are a little bit varied around the state, and in some respects begin and end earlier in the calendar year, than people are accustomed to there on the left coast. That said, let's move on to your all Cabernet Sauvignon wine, or nearly all Cabernet Sauvignon wine, also from 2021, Jasper.
Yes, absolutely. And this is one I like to showcase just because in the industry and for such a long time, cab has been king. And it's when people think of states like New Mexico, I think to Michelle and Marco's point earlier, they don't think that vinifera is going to come from these states and be able to stand on its own two legs. And so this is also old vine cab. So Paulo planted this in 86 when he showed up here in New Mexico. I was born in 86. It took me 10 years to talk Paulo into letting me have any of this fruit. So I feel like I'm working with my peer group every year when it shows up to the winery. The vines are absolutely gorgeous. And it's funny. We get a lot of international interns at the winery to work harvest with us. And when this fruit showed up, I had this Italian couple that was working with us this year, both very good winemakers. And they're like, what is this? They're like, where is this from? They couldn't. And I saw them do that a lot of times this year. And I see people from around the world do that. They work harvest all across the world. And that gets me excited because they're excited about fruit, right? Not about wine, not about what I can do as a winemaker, but just seeing a bin show up off the back of one of my trucks. For me as a winemaker, I try to do oak integration to be balanced. And I do the kind of same targets for when I pick fruit, for winemaking, for oxygen management as well. But this is something that I think it's put me on a map as a winery because I have a lot of people that I think would never jumped into New Mexican wine. We're never going to be able to overcrop in New Mexico. We just don't have the growing climate for it. So from a winemaker standpoint, you don't have to worry about that. But from a grower standpoint, it's hard to get, as Michelle said earlier, it's hard to make money whenever you can never get a big crop yield as a grower. And so it's something that we're cast into. So why not showcase it?
Michelle, let's use that as a nice move to your wines. You provided 3 reds here. You say what's gonna be tasted first.
We should start off with the Nebbiolo.
Mm-hmm.
This is from Marco and Paolo's vineyard down south. And just to echo what Jasper was saying about how grateful we are for what Luna Rossa has been able to do for the state is really quite remarkable. And when we first got started, we planted our vineyards. But of course, that takes quite a bit of time and nurturing to actually come to fruition. And buying grapes from Paolo was necessary and will always be necessary. We're just never going to be able to grow enough grapes for our entire production. And the fact that we have somebody that is so talented and knowledgeable growing excellent fruit is such an asset to all of us in the state. And Nebbiolo, of course, can be a little tricky, and we don't get to have these grapes every year. When we're lucky, we are able to make a vintage. And just to clarify, I personally am not a hands-on winemaker. That's my husband and his brother, Chris. So Chris and Jesse, brothers, they are the ones that had the bright idea to start this winery. And I just get to be part of it and bossy and wear several hats and get to be a part of the winemaking appreciation and of course the marketing of it. But one of the things that I think is really important is to talk about what Nebbiolo can and should be. And I think a lot of times it's overproduced and comes across very not proper, not a proper varietal expression. And what I love about what Jesse and Chris are able to do is to actually have a completely beautiful, elegant Nebbiolo that reflects what you would find in different areas of northern Italy without it being this. A lot of American producers are claiming that they make Nebbiolo, but it really tastes more like a cab. And of course, they're probably blending quite a bit.
Take you away from hiding your light under a bushel a little bit there, Michelle. Part of your career in wine has been getting yourself around to act as a judge in many wine competitions, both nationally and internationally, thereby informing yourself of what else is happening throughout the world, not only in the United States, but also throughout the world, to get a sense of how you can add to the uplifting of Vivac and wines and New Mexico wines overall. So don't sell yourself short in all. That has value. And you and your marketing expertise, no less, adds to it all. This Nebbiolo is absolutely put together. I'm not going to tell anybody here that they should mistake it for anything from the Langhe, but it is clearly Nebbiolo grape. It is a well-balanced wine. and not nearly as, shall we say, demonstrably tannic as a young Nebbiolo you might get from the aforementioned Langhe there in Italy. Your next red wine here is, you tell me, you got two Bordeaux-type varieties here. You got a Merlot and Cabernet Franc. What should we be tasting first?
Cabernet Franc, please.
Okay.
And so these are from our Abbott vineyard, one of our estate vineyards. This is the slightly lower elevation, the 5,800 feet. And it is situated next to the Rio Grande in its own beautiful little tiny microclimate. It is 4 acres there. And it was planted about 38 years ago by the Abbott family. And we have been entrusted to take over the management of their vineyard and make what we consider some of our best wines. The high altitude does offer great natural acidity and a little minerality component that I think is really unique. With that, you also get brighter fruit aspects. While a lot of people are making Cabernet Franc and Merlot in the state, ours does show a nice combination of those rich, darker fruit, but also those bright high notes of more red berry. And I really like that kind of balance that our vineyard up here is able to offer us. And yes, thank you, David, for mentioning my other career. I do find that because I do judge all over the world and do quite a bit of writing and work in different avenues of the wine industry, that is an important part to bring back to the winery. And I, to Jesse and Chris's chagrin, am always full of opinions and ideas. And I love Cabernet Franc. I think it is a wonderful grape. It's one of my personal favorites. I love tasting the expression that it has and can show all over the world. And so for me personally, this is one of my favorite grapes that we use and make.
On to the Merlot, please.
Yes. And of course, I think we're finally all moving past the sideways challenge that people really wanted to shit on Merlot. And now we're coming back from that. And a lot of producers are making incredibly beautiful, crafted, attention-getting Merlots. And I think this is one of those contenders. It, again, with the high altitude, offers a really unique perspective on Merlot. It does have some nice spicy notes in it, and that lighter red berry coming in with the darker fruit notes really offers something fresh and different. For us, we market this as the Merlot that Merlot haters love. And because it is a nice expression that shows something a little varied that the grape can do.
And there's a little bit of a black olive character you sometimes find in warmer type of Merlots you'll find in Europe as well. But it's got the black olive character amongst everything else that Merlots often have. I like it.
Thank you.
Sorry, I interject something on that.
Please.
I don't know why. I really liked the Merlot, and I'm not sure if you're familiar with a really popular brand of cherries that come out of Italy. It's called Fabri.
Hmm?
A lot of people use them for cocktails now, but in Italy, it's more like for gelatos and other desserts. I don't know why, but immediately on taste, it reminds me of Fabri.
Nice.
I'm not sure. Sometimes you just have a recollection of something you've tasted before. For me, on first taste, I immediately got Fabri cherries. Not sure why, but I love Fabri cherries personally. That's, for me, the perfect company to an old-fashioned.
Oh, that's awesome. I can't wait to get a jar of them and experiment with some drinks.
Yeah, I'll look to get you some. Unfortunately, in the States, they're super pricey. It's
Must be-
$15 for a jar of 10 of them. I'm not even joking.
Moving on. Marco, we are now going into your 2023 Vermentino, which we mentioned briefly before. It's clocking in at just under 13% alcohol, so you've managed the alcohol well on this. And the motivation for you and or Paolo to plant Vermentino was?
We were going back to this discussion of personal tastes. We're big fans of, I imagine most people are familiar with the Friuli region for white wines. I'm a big fan of those kind of more vibrant, have those big, can have those big minerality notes, have that kind of bigger acidity whites that come out of that area. Unfortunately, or fortunately, we don't have the same climate as that area, but it's always something I strive for a little bit. So we try to look elsewhere and somewhere else that can produce something akin to that, but in a warmer climate. So we thought to look towards Sardinia. So we thought maybe a Vermentino as a grape in itself would work out well. And so far, we've been very happy with it. As much as you would like to think, this doesn't have an acidity correction on it. This is as it comes out. Would acidity correction make it even better? Debatable. Maybe it would have. But I was honestly just so proud that I was able to make a white that was so refreshing for myself that I felt compelled to leave it as is. And I would have even done it even drier, but my fermentation stopped just under 1%. And honestly, it just felt so balanced that I didn't want to mess with it. I felt this was one of those wines that it did what it wanted to do. You need to work it the least amount as possible. So all I did was our basic filtration and bottle. This was really like a hands-off wine compared to sometimes on a Chardonnay, you got to work with it a bit because if not, you're going to have a pH that's too high and no longevity, no freshness.
It's clearly characteristically Vermentino. There's a little bit of a roundness or a glycerin, perhaps, inflected quality to it that may separate it from what you'd find on Sardinia, which tends to be a bit more tart and tight, whether from Gallura, DOCG, or elsewhere on the island. That would be the only thing, and maybe that's effect of the heat, the sun in New Mexico doing that to it. Other than that, it's perfectly correct, easily enjoyable, balanced Vermentino, easy to drink. Jasper, do you have that with you as well there?
I do.
What do you think?
And so I've always liked it. I've had it before and I've always liked it. And I'm curious to see it in the vineyard. I've never been offered the fruit, so I know that there's not much of it planted. But I'm curious to see it in the vineyard and see how it looks because I think it could be a real winner for the state. And to Marco's note, when you can not intervene too much with the wine, and it's always it feels good as a winemaker, especially whenever it's your family growing the fruit, because you just know the fruit quality's there to showcase it. And this was one of my own favorites. One thing that Michele left out about the Padberg story that I don't believe there was a member of the family that was of 21 years of age when they applied to get a wine grower's license. I think they had to sit out and wait to actually get their license to turn 21 to legally make wine in New Mexico.
And yeah, Chris wasn't even 21. But the cool thing is you can own a winery before you're 21. You just can't legally drink any of the wine.
Good thing is a lot of tasting and spitting that's involved. Marco, if you could please be so kind as to move us along. Yet another Italian variety that might not be resonant in people's ears. I love the way it spills off the lips. Negro Amaro. Yeah. Walk us through it.
Yes. Negro Amaro was actually a grape that this goes back to the same thing. Me and my dad were discussing what areas we think match, negating the fact of altitude, because obviously most of Italy is a lot lower than us, disregarding the mountains. But we immediately thought that Puglia was a very similar region in the sense that they get these higher temperatures. They have some desert areas, with the difference of them being though lower in altitude and some water present there, obviously, because they have the entire sea surrounding them. But a grape that we seriously considered from the Salento region was Negro Amaro, which we thought was going to do good here just based off of Apulia's climate in general. And I'll be honest, I think the plant loves it here. Really, it absolutely loves it. This is probably the varietal I have that has the most green growth.
That's common enough for the variety in its native Puglia as well.
It seems like it's so happy with making all this green foliage that it's like, there's no worries. We're good for the coming years. I'll tell you right now, I'm averaging about 2 tons an acre, which is, it is worth growing because the wine, it comes out nice, in my opinion. But it definitely wants to test you. I don't know many grape growers commercially that would want to keep something that doesn't want to push over 2 tons an acre.
You can see that why this is never caught on in California, given the cost of doing business over there. But you've done it. But I have to say, having some familiarity with Puglia, having been there twice, written about them, and sold the wines for a famous Italian wine importer long ago for the number one grower in the region. This is a really great expression of a grape variety that is, for many reasons, unheralded and overlooked. But for people who want to know, Negro Amaro quite often can be soft in tannins or low, generally speaking. It has a, shall we say, a rich middle palate, but not necessarily one that's based upon fruit. It's more about just a lovely high-ish alcohol, to be sure, and a very velvety tanning character. And it's not very high in anthocyanins. It doesn't have a great color. It doesn't hold color very well in general terms. So you have a kind of a pale expression here in terms of its appearance, but on the palate, it feels on the full side, but doesn't feel stuffed with fruit and tannins. It's an interesting style of wine that could be attractive for some people who might find, for example, Cabernet Sauvignon to be a bit too intense for them.
And there's actually, in terms of DNA, it's actually loosely related to Sangiovese. At some point in time, there were a crossing between each other. So I think it makes these, a lot of people consider these not excessively tannic wines, but high variability taste wines. They're very different than the bulk of red wines, if you want to put it that way.
Very supple. It's easy to enjoy. Again, I can enjoy it alone by itself, or there's enough acidity there that in the low tannins, that's the kind of thing that I would love with a real fatty piece of barbecue straight off the grill. Could be an easy way to go there. And the last of our 9 wines we're tasting today is a personal favorite of mine. I'm so glad that Marco chose to include it here. And that is the Reserve Aglianico, a grape variety that is even less heralded than Negro Amaro and less used, even in Italy. It's very kind of an isolated side of grape variety. You find expressions of it not only here in Luna Rossa in New Mexico. There are some people doing great work with it, albeit in very small, tiny quantities in the neighboring Texas. But this Reserve Aglianico is, as I say, in the aggregate of all New Mexican red wines, this has been my single favorite wine that I've enjoyed. And I've enjoyed others from the Andrea family as well as other folks that are great wines. But as far as like ongoing regular, the Reserve Aglianico from Luna Rossa, to me, is my single favorite red wine out of New Mexico. And thank you for sending it.
Thank you. This one would have been planted prior to my definite involvement in making decisions at the winery, but I will say it was a good choice. So typically, unless you're drinking Aglianico di Voltura from Basilicata, alternatively, it's also called Taurasi in Campania. This specifically is considered a Taurasi clone, so this would be more akin to the Campania version of it. Are there big differences? Most likely not. However, I am super happy with this wine. I think it's very crazy the fact that you could have a wine like this. I'll be honest, this wine is actually more than palatable as soon as it's ready. But it just tastes so much better when it's aged.
And this is 2017 we're tasting today. I remember tasting vintages as far back as 2012, and if I can recollect. But yeah.
Yeah, I think our first vintage of this one was 2010, I believe. But I didn't even have a full palate. But now it's a little more consistent. But this is a 2017, 5 years on oak, mostly French. It's about 80-20 French to American. Nothing new. It's all used. So mostly just for micro-oxygenating. But I think that this one's fruit expression through aging is absolutely ridiculous. Like the amount of volatile aromas that fall off on a lot of wines when you age is quite exponential. And this one, it seems like it never has enough. It's, oh no, don't worry, I'm still here. And that's probably my biggest thing about it. I would say when I first started drinking wine more consistently, more when I moved to Italy, I immediately was like, oh no, Nebbiolo's the only big grape for me. But now after it's been a while, I actually think if you ask my dad, I'm sure he's still saying Nebbiolo, but actually at the moment, I prefer Aglianico. I think it just has this varietal expression, especially in this area, that's just like tremendous. It definitely distinguishes itself. On top of that, not a lot of people do know it. There's obviously some issues with how you pronounce the GLI in Italian, so a lot of people feel like can be a bit afraid to order it. But I feel like this is a grape that definitely acclimated as it should for southern New Mexico. I think this was definitely a pinnacle grape for us on our reserve wines. And I always recommend people that if they're into kind of more developed reds, this is something I would try personally. And in Italy, Aglianico, really not that popular up north. But it does have, in Italy, Aglianico has the denomination of being Barolo del Sud, which just means the Barolo of the South. It's known in southern Italy that this is their best grade. Albeit, the most expensive Aglianico I've ever found in Italy was been like 30 euros, which is absolutely crazy of a price.
Look, one of the things that this tasting has allowed is showing the great diversity of what New Mexico can offer. We've tasted, sure, there's a disproportionately large number of Italian varieties here, but we also have some great Bordeaux varieties. We have the classic, questionably domestic versus hybrid versus mission here. So we have a wide range of wines. There is a high number of reds, to be sure. That said, there are more whites, rosés, and sweets to be found in New Mexico. As I said earlier, nmwine.com to get the broader picture. And if you could please each share with us your website and the fact that everybody here will gladly ship outside of New Mexico into all states that allow for it. For those of you who are wishing to taste these wines, and I recommend you do, be sure to contact Michele Padberg at Vivac Winery. What's your website there, Michele?
Vivacwinery.com.
And Jasper Riddle, yours?
Noisywaterwinery.com.
And Marco?
LunaRossaWinery.com with 2 S's.
Okay. There's a lot more available in New Mexico, both with food and wine. We haven't even touched upon that at all today. Maybe that's another episode later in the year. But do check out New Mexico wines. Thank you, Jasper. Thank you, Marco. Thank you, Michele, for joining Drinking on the Edge.
It was so much fun.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.